Father asked me to come and speak today, and I told him why, because Father Bogdan spoke last year. And who was here for Father Bogdan's talk? Some of you. Okay, not a lot. That's good, because he's much better than I am. And that means you can't compare me. That's good. That's a good thing. Because I told him, well, you're putting me right after Father Bogdan Kladio, who's a phenomenal speaker from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada. And he asked me to speak about Lent. And so it is a topic that I'm a little bit passionate about. I think as Orthodox Christians, we all should be passionate about it, the Lenten journey. But I wanted to maybe offer a slightly different perspective, because I think a lot of times we've kind of covered the whole idea of what Lent is, the structure of Lent, fasting, the journey towards Pascha. We've covered that most of the time. At least we should have. But I'll start with a little story. When I was 15 years old, back in 1996, I was in the youth group at St. Nicholas, and we were lucky enough to travel to the Holy Land that year with our youth group. We went with 40 young people, and we were able to visit Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, all the different sites. And one of the places that we were able to go was actually into Egypt. We flew there first, and we went to Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, where Moses got the Ten Commandments. The monastery of St. Catherine's is there. It's the oldest still working Orthodox monastery in the world. So that was a very, very profound experience for me. And we had the great blessing to be able to climb the mountain, because there's a small path that goes up the mountain to where the site is where Moses got the Ten Commandments, and then down at the bottom is the monastery. And so what they like to do, the pilgrims, is they like to start really early in the morning, around 2:30, to start climbing, because it takes you about 3 to 3.5 hours to climb it, give or take. And most people like to get to the top of the mountain just when the sun is coming up over the Sinai Peninsula, which is a very phenomenal sight to experience. And so, we got all together, and we started climbing the mountain. It was pitch dark. I had my little flashlight from the dollar store that didn't work very well, and it was already dying on me. And so I was climbing it, kind of got lost, lost the parea, the group that I was climbing with. And at one point, I was kind of, I guess, maybe halfway up the mountain, and you could kind of follow the little path. There were other pilgrims going. And at one point, my flashlight burned out, and I couldn't really see much. But it was really interesting that at that moment, I was kind of getting very tired. I was 15 years old. And as you climbed, the air got a little thinner, it got a little colder. And at one point, I turned around, and it was pitch dark. And because it was pitch dark, you could see the stars, you could see the moon. And through the Sinai Peninsula, you could see this little trail of lights. And it was pilgrims, it was people going through the mountains, coming towards the Mount Sinai, and you could see that all the way behind you, which was I still get goosebumps when I think about this, because I probably wouldn't have paid attention to that if my flashlight was still working and I was just heading up the mountain. And of course, then I was able to reach the top, and I got there just when the sun was coming up, so I got to see the sunrise. I got to take a picture of it, and that was a very profound experience. So my perception of that event, and also my perception of that place, has forever been changed because of that experience. And I want to tell you that story because I'm going to come back to it later on in my presentation about how our perception changes. Because really, Lent is all about the change of perception. The change of perception of ourselves, the change of perception about our spirituality, who we are in relationship to God, the change of perception, who we are in relationship to one another, and also the change of perception of what we're supposed to be doing in our lives, not during Lent, but during the rest of the time that we claim to be Orthodox Christians, the rest of the year. So I had asked all of you before we started to fill out these little papers that we just chopped up, and I thank Dimitra for doing it last minute. And I asked all of you to write 2 words, freedom and slavery, which we'll talk about, and to write beside those words what's the first thing that comes to mind, because we all have heard those words, but maybe they mean different things to us. So I got a lot of responses. I only picked some of the interesting ones. They're all interesting. Nobody gets a fail, but some of them were funny, and then some of them were actually really, really interesting. So I'm going to read some of them because I think they're very telling about how we view these things. So freedom and slavery. Here's one. It says freedom equals happiness, and slavery equals being confined. That's very interesting. That happiness, we would equate freedom to happiness. I'm going to come back to that one because that's really, really important, I think. Another one here says freedom means a clear conscience, and slavery means being punished. Interesting. We'll come back to that one. That's especially the slavery one. Here's another one. Freedom equals light. Slavery equals darkness. That's really good. I'll come back to that one. You guys are making my presentation for me. Just throw out everything else I had. Here's another one. Freedom of the Christian faith versus slavery to the material world. You just summed up my whole thesis. But, all right, we'll put that one there. This is really interesting. It equates, it says freedom equals faith, and slavery is compassion for everyone. Very interesting. Slavery is compassion for everyone. Never heard that one before. That's very good. This is a textbook answer. Somebody in here is a theologian. When you are freed by grace of God from desiring the passions, then you are totally free. My thesis statement. Slavery is total freedom to engage in the passions, makes you a slave to the passions. Thanks for giving that away. And the last one that I picked here was freedom equals free will. Again, very interesting. We'll come back to that. And slavery equals to be controlled and also to experience pain. Very interesting. Okay, so a lot of good stuff. So where do we go? Okay, when we think about the church, usually we think about an institution. We think about the building, or we think about, sometimes we say the people of God, right? Ecclesia, the Greek word, which means to be called out, to be a separate people, ekkleo, right, in Greek. And so we think of these people of God coming out from the rest of humanity, from the rest of the people, the rest of the population. But to be called out from the rest of everyone else kind of means that you're leaving everyone else behind for a certain period of time. That's the logical kind of conclusion that we can come with. That when we are being called out, when we are entering into kind of a special place, which is the church, and we are coming together to become what is the church, we are leaving behind what everybody else is. That would be the logical conclusion. And so there is this idea in the Orthodox Church, I'm sure many of us have heard of it, is the idea of, dying to the world. And you hear this a lot in monastic literature, right? So when we talk about the monks and the nuns, the life that they lead is a life of leaving the world, entering into a monastery, focusing on spirituality, depriving themselves of the most natural conveniences that we have. They don't watch TV, they don't listen to the news, they don't listen to radio, they don't have internet. Well, some of them do, but anyways. But most of them are not supposed to. Cell phones, things like that. And they kind of leave this world. This idea that the world is something to be renounced. Now, this is something very interesting for us because we, as people living in the world, who have jobs and families and, we're part of this world, sometimes we have great difficulty thinking about the idea of renouncing the world. Now, I use the word renouncing because it's not exactly the same thing as rejecting the world. Rejection and renunciation are two different things. Rejection is basically saying, I don't want this anymore, it's evil, it's bad, get rid of it, I don't want to see it. Renunciation is something a little bit different. And I think I want to kind of emphasize a little bit this idea of renunciation and the place of Lent, especially the place of Lent in the religious year, and how that is a type of renunciation of the world for us as Christians. And what does that do to us? Why do we do that? Why do we focus on renouncing many of the pleasures of the world, and for what reason? Some of them may be obvious, some of them may not be so obvious. Most of our friends that we may speak to, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox, a lot of times have the same kind of questions about the church. They wonder why we do the things that we do, especially when we are in a fasting period and they're not fasting. Usually the questions are, why? Why are you doing this? What is the purpose? It seems to me, at least one of my friends told me this, he said, Father, it seems to me that you have to live by a lot of rules. And you have to basically live your life a certain way, the way the institution tells you need to live. And to me, that seems like a form of slavery. That seems that you're not really free. And my friend was telling me, I am free. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to go to any particular type of church. I don't need to subscribe to any type of religion. the ultimate form of freedom, at least in this world, would be an atheist, right? There is no God, and so I have no rules. I am God. I can do whatever I want. And so there's this idea that freedom equals doing whatever you want. Or as somebody said here, freedom is happiness. That's a good word, happiness, which I don't know if I would necessarily agree with the word happy, because happy is an emotion, and happy, sometimes we feel happy and sometimes we feel bad, sometimes we feel sad. But I would say that, as Orthodox Christians, we would definitely not focus on what makes us happy or what makes us sad, but rather what makes us holy. And there's a big difference between those things. Now, it's true that modern day society emphasizes that, we should be able to do whatever we want as long as we don't hurt other people. And sometimes, even if we hurt other people, we still should have the freedom to do whatever we want. And we can see this in the different laws that are being passed these days, not just abortion laws, but, doctor-assisted suicide and things like that we're seeing are becoming legal in more countries, including Canada, unfortunately. So it's this idea that we can do whatever we want, and nobody should tell us what to do with our bodies, or nobody should tell us what to think or what to believe. And so this is kind of the spirit of this world that we are trying to renounce. This idea that the world is feeding our ego. It's feeding, the idea that we are gods, that we can do what we want. And of course, that is the same delusion that the snake spoke to Eve and to Adam. The idea that you can do what you want. You don't need any rules. And if you do those things, you will be like God, because God is free. God does what he wants. And so this is the great delusion of the devil. The idea that we are gods. Not that we can become gods, but we are gods. And that we don't need anybody to become better or to become perfect. We are perfect in ourselves. And this is the great sin of Adam and Eve. The idea that they didn't think they needed God to reach perfection. And of course, we know as Orthodox Christians that we do need God to reach perfection. And so when we look at Great Lent as a spiritual journey, let's take a look at some of the themes, because there are themes that are presented to us during every Sunday. And they're very deliberate, and they're there to emphasize a certain type of renunciation. So we see that, what is the first Sunday of Lent? Anybody know? What is it dedicated to? Orthodoxy, yes. So what are we celebrating in Sunday of Orthodoxy? Icons, right? And what are icons? Images of what? Of saints. And? Jesus, God, yes. Are icons realistic? Do they look realistic? Like pictures? No, they look otherly. They look different. Why? Does anyone know? You guys used to have Father Ted Kufos here. You guys should know this. Why do icons look different? Sorry? Well, the icon doesn't reach theosis. We were supposed to reach theosis. Yes. You're on the right track. It's showing us something different. Kind of, yes. You're on the right track. So it's the idea that the icon is not supposed to be reflecting this reality. It's not supposed to be reflecting this world, but rather it's reflecting the next world, the perfect world, the spiritualized world, right? And so even saints, people who lived, they don't look like the way they looked when they were in life, but rather they look as they are supposed to be. Beautiful, light. That's why they have the photostefano, they have the nimbus, right? The halo, the light of Christ shining through them. This is why the colors are very vibrant. This is why the shapes are very geometric and light. They have no mass, right? They're emphasizing this kind of idea of, being in this ethereal world, this heavenly realm. And so the icons always give us a vision of something else. And where do we find icons? We usually find them in the church. We don't find them everywhere else. We don't find them in malls. We don't find them. We put them other places as Orthodox Christians, and we'll talk about that later. We put them in our cars and we put them in our homes, right? But really, the source is usually the church. This is where the tradition of the icons come from. So that's the first Sunday of Lent. What is the second Sunday of Lent? It's a little trickier. St. Gregory Palamas. Who was St. Gregory Palamas? Anybody? And it's a tough one. I don't feel bad. He was a monk. That's right. Theologian, lived in the 14th century. He was Archbishop of Thessalonica, and he spoke about the essence and energies of God. So he spoke about, not to get too wordy now in theology, but he spoke about
the unapproachable light.
The unapproachable light, right? And he spoke a lot about what the apostles experienced on Mount Tabor when they saw Christ metamorphosed, right? Metamorphosis, the transfiguration. They saw Christ illumined, right? He showed a bit of his divine nature, right? So they saw the light and they were blinded and they fell on their faces because they couldn't bear it, right? And so monastics at the time of St. Gregory Palamas, monks who were on Mount Athos, through ascesi, asceticism, struggle, fasting, prayer, believed that they could glimpse this light, that they would have these visions of the uncreated light. And they were criticized by the West for this, especially the Catholics. They would say, well, this is ridiculous. They're just delusional, right? You can't see God. You can't see any part of him. And St. Gregory Palamas said, well, we can't know God in his essence. We can't know what he really is, but we can see how he works in the world when he reveals himself to us. And those are the energies of God. That's just a quick little history/dogmatic lesson, okay? So there's the essence of God, which is unknowable. We can't know it, but there are the energies of God, which we can see. And those are the things that we see through miracles. We see it in the burning bush with Moses. Moses sees the backside of God when he's receiving the Ten Commandments. He's not actually seeing God, but he's seeing something that God is revealing to him, right? The apostles saw the light of the resurrection, right? All these things are the energies of God that he is working within the world. But all these things do not reveal to us the nature of the world, but rather they reveal to us the nature of God, who God is, what is our spiritual nature. So again, St. Gregory Palamas is placed in the second week of Lent to remind us of this idea of the experience of the uncreated, the experience of the divine, which is something very real in the Orthodox Church. What is the third Sunday of Lent? Not the same people. Anyone? There's a hint around my neck. That's right. Well, Stavros, right? So it's the Sunday of the cross, right? So we celebrate the cross. And again, the cross, although at first sight would make us think of a very worldly event, right? The crucifixion, very sad time, the passion of Christ, right? At the same time, we know that it is through the cross that joy comes into the world, because it is through the cross that Christ overcomes death. So again, there is this idea of overcoming the world, being able to control the world, because Christ is the author of life. So he overcomes it, tramples down death by death, and of course 3 days later he resurrects. And so again, the cross is a symbol that used to mean death, used to mean worldliness, but now for Christians is a symbol of life. It's a paradox. And so again, a symbol of escape from the world. What is the fourth Sunday of Lent? This was last week. John Climacus, yeah. Or Aios Ioannis Climacus. Does anyone know who St. John Climacus was? Another monk. That's a good one. Yeah, yes.
He wrote the Ladder of Divine Ascent.
That's right. He wrote the work called The Ladder of Divine Ascent, I Climaka. Climaka means ladder in Greek. And this book, which has become very popular, although originally written for monastics, it was written for his own monks, because he was the abbot of Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, where I visited when I was 15 years old. And he wrote this, I guess you could say, spiritual instruction, which consists of 30 steps on the ladder. And each step, each ring, represents a different passion, a different struggle in our spirituality. And he likens it to climbing. We fight these passions, and as we overcome them, we become closer. We climb closer to God. It's a beautiful metaphor. And it is one of many examples that we get from the fathers of the church. But again, we see that if we open up the book of the Ladder of Divine Ascent, the first step is called? That's right, renunciation of the world. Right, that's the first step, to understand that we need to renounce the world. And so that's very, very interesting that, we can't do anything until we understand what this world is and how we are to treat it. So very, very interesting. So this Sunday is the last Sunday of Lent before we come to Palm Sunday next Sunday. And what do we celebrate today? That's right, Saint Mary of Egypt. And of course, who was she? Anyone know? It's a very racy story. Yes, she was a bad girl. Yes? Okay. So yeah, so the story is that actually technically St. Mary was not a prostitute because prostitutes take money for what they do. St. Mary did not. So she was more likened to a sex addict, actually. So she would do it for nothing. And she lived a very depraved life. And yes, she did a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and was not able to enter into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where the tomb and the crucifixion are located. And she had a conversion experience at that moment. She repented. She had a vision of the Virgin Mary. She was able to go in the next day and attend the services. And then what did she do? That's right. She went out to the Eremo, the desert. That's right. So then she went out into the desert. And she stayed there the rest of her life. So that was a rejection of the world, completely. And she lived in the desert alone, extreme fasting, and was communed only at the end of her life by St. Zosimos, who was a traveling priest, who was coming through the area, communed her once, and then found her the next year that she had passed away. And so this is like a kind of an ultimate, very radical example of not rejecting, but renouncing the world. And so we see that really the theme of Lent is this idea of renouncing. So the question is, what do we do, right? So, do we renounce? And do we understand why that we should renounce it? Because it seems to me that at least myself growing up here in Canada, here in Toronto, even myself as I grew up, we take a very kind of laid back, relaxed approach to Lent. The Greeks too were kind of very guilty of this amongst jurisdictions, generally speaking, because and this is not to criticize us, but it's good to know, right, what we do and how we approach it. So we see usually Lent like many of our non-Christian friends see it. We see it as a rule. Sometimes we understand that it's good for us. It helps teach us self-control. It helps us cleanse our bodies. It helps us it makes us feel more spiritual on some level, but we don't understand why. And because we see it kind of only on this level, many of us choose to opt out of it, or we choose to tailor it to our own needs or our own likes, right? So what is the most popular thing that most Greeks tell me? I'm going to do the first week, I'm going to do the last week. Right? In between, forget about it. And you usually see that in the church services, right? The first few weeks is really busy, and then, it kind of tapers off, and it's kind of quiet. And then right before Holy Week, it gets busy again, right? That's when everybody comes back. And we do it this way because we feel that, hey, at least I did that. We do this because we have difficulty as human beings sustaining spiritual effort for long periods of time. And so what we do is we'll do a little bit, and then sometimes we'll rationalize and let go of it, and then we'll come back to it near the end. Some of us don't come back to it at all. Now, I would say that I want to come back to one of the papers here. I'm sorry, I'm trying to organize because there's quite a few good ones. But one of the purposes of the fast and of the Lenten season, here somebody wrote, freedom is light and slavery is darkness. Has anyone ever read a little bit of philosophy? Plato? Anyone? School? Is anyone familiar with Plato's cave analogy? Right. So if anybody who's not familiar with it, Plato, was speaking about knowledge, right? He wasn't speaking about Christianity, of course, because he's before Christianity. But he likens most of humanity as people who have grown up in a dark cave, chained down and facing the wall, not the opening, but the wall. And there's a fire behind them, and there's a light that flashes from behind them, and all they see is their shadows on the wall. And that's what he likens real life to be, this earthly life. That most people who do not pursue philosophy and true knowledge, everything that they perceive in life is a type of shadow. It is just mimics of things that are really real on the outside. And they'll never get to see the outside. And he says that even if one of them breaks free of those chains and climbs outside, first of all, they're blinded by the light, just like the apostles were blinded by the true light of Tabor, right? And then their eyes adjust, and they actually see the world for what it is. But then they come back into the cave to tell their friends what happened. The problem is that their friends say, "You're crazy. That's not true. You're delusional," right? And if we think about this metaphor, a lot of the fathers use this metaphor when speaking about spiritual life, because many times this is the same way that theoses, Georgia mentioned that. Theosis is the idea of being illumined to the point where we become like God. We have union with God, right? That is the end of the spiritual effort. Many of those people who have reached that in the church were considered to be crazy. Or they were persecuted, or they were completely rejected, not only by those outside of the church, but sometimes by people inside of the church. And so many times we kind of write those people off. They don't know what they're talking about. Because we, most of us, and I include myself in this, we've become comfortable with the shadows on the wall. We've become comfortable with the way things are. And so when we look at Lent, Lent is that opportunity to climb outside the cave, believe it or not. Many people think that Lent is about shackling yourself down, being tied down by all this stuff. Okay, we got to get ready now. We got to load up with all these rules in Lent because it's going to be really, really tough and we got to make it to the end. But really, Lent is about escaping from the cave, escaping from the delusion of the world. And the way we do this is to learn how to free ourselves from those things that control us. And this is why I asked you guys about freedom and slavery, because that's really what it's all about. It's all about either we are free or we are slaves, but not the way that the world thinks that we are. Because the world, they will tell you that freedom is what the Orthodox would say is slavery. And the world would say slavery is what we would say is freedom. And that is extremely dangerous for us. Why? Because we live in the world. And the more time that we spend in the world, away from the church, away from the divine services, away from the sacraments, away from the spiritual life, the more we are manipulated and brainwashed by that mentality. The more the snake speaks to us, not God. Okay? Does that make sense? So this is the problem, is that the wisdom of God, as the Apostle Paul says, is higher and different than the wisdom of the world. It is opposite. And so how do we emancipate ourselves? How do we free ourselves? Well, fasting, for example. Fasting is just one thing that we're supposed to be doing during Lent, not the only thing. But fasting is something that many of us do not see as essential, and really it is the one thing that actually begins to free us from those bonds. Because if we think about it this way, let's look at the whole year. We're supposed to be fasting as Orthodox Christians Wednesdays and Fridays throughout the whole year, except for a few exceptions. Let's not even talk about the great fasts, okay? So if I can't say no to a burger on Wednesday, right, which for me is sometimes hard. Look at me, right? Okay? So it can be hard. But if I can't say no to that burger for like one day, that means that the burger controls me. I am a slave to that thing. And it's not even slavery to a person. Some of you wrote here that slavery is to, regimes or governments, right? Makari. Like, if I was a slave to somebody who actually had a mind, who could manipulate me, I would feel a little better. But it's a burger. It's a thing. And the thing is controlling me. The thing is controlling me. And that's what's really sad. Just like, the fruit in the Garden of Eden, it wasn't necessarily an apple. I don't know where we got the apple from. Okay? But it was the fruit. It was a thing. Sure, it was manipulated by the devil, but it was a thing. And so that should make us very worried that we are controlled by things, by simple things that we can't say no to. So the world, when we talk about renouncing the world, we are talking about freeing ourselves from those things that control us so that we can attain real freedom. The freedom that Christ shows us in his life, because Christ is tempted but does not sin, right? He overcomes. And then we are able to love the world. Now, this is interesting, okay? So we have to renounce the world so we can love the world. It's weird, okay? How does that work? Well, you can't love something that you're addicted to. You can't. Some people say, well, I really love that. I'm addicted to it. No, you can't really love something. When we use the word love, what do we mean? Anyone know? From a Christian point of view, what is love? It's a big word. What is love? Nobody knows? Yes.
Love a person.
Love a person. That's a good start. What does Christ do?
Love is God and it comes from your heart.
Okay, love is God. It comes from your heart. Think about doing. What does Christ do for us? Sacrifice. That's the word. The word is sacrifice, right? So real love Real love is selfless love, right? It is the self-sacrifice. Somebody wrote it here, actually. This is the, oh yeah, here. Freedom is faith and slavery is compassion for everyone. Really interesting. Because if we're talking about slavery to God, yes, it is compassion for everyone. Being a true servant of God is to have compassion for everyone, which is hard, which is not fun sometimes, which doesn't make you happy sometimes, because sometimes doing things for other people, giving up what we want to do, giving up what we love to do, is very difficult. Sometimes we do it kicking and screaming, but we do it sometimes, right? And so, being loving in that way, being selfless, is not fun all the time. It's not always happy, but it is holy. It is the right thing to do. I'm sure Christ was not having a happy time on the cross, okay? But it was the ultimate expression of love. And so when we talk about love, when we talk about loving the world, it means that we can only love the world when we are not controlled by it. When we are controlled by things, we can do a number of things. We can hate those things that we're controlled by. I wish I could cut smoking, for example. I don't smoke, I'm just saying. Okay? But I'm addicted to that. I wish, many people who tell me they're addicted to things, they describe a hate for those things, but they can't stop. How many people do you know that have an addiction to something, right? And they just can't stop. They hate that thing. They don't love it because it controls them, because they feel weak when they're around it. It's a momentary gratification, but afterwards you feel horrible. And so that can be anything: food, sex, money, drugs, alcohol, anything. Relationships. So when we are controlled by these things, we are incapable of loving them. We can hate them. We can be controlled by them. We can have a fixation on them, but it's not love because we can't let go. Christ is about letting go, right? What does God do? He gives us this great gift of free will, right? Free will. Somebody wrote it. Here it is. Freedom is free will. Slavery is being controlled, and pain. Pain can be translated into suffering. Yes. Very good answers, guys. You helped me today. Because that's the reality, that God loves us so much that he gives us free will. And we know, of course, that our free will means that some of us love him and some of us don't. This is why the horrible things happen in the world. And also the very wonderful things happen in the world because of free will. But God gives us that free will. So he loves the world. And because he loves the world, he gives us our freedom. He doesn't control us. And we have to learn how to be like God. That's theosis. And so we have to learn how to let go and not be controlled by the world. That's where the renunciation comes from. That's why it seems like a paradox that we are fasting, we are not enjoying certain things at certain times, not forever, but at certain times in our lives. We are not saying that those things are evil. We are not saying those things are bad. We are not saying those things are not good for us. All we're saying is that we as human beings are so weak that we need to learn how to control those things so that they don't control us. And we have to learn how to control our bodies so our bodies don't control our souls and our minds and our hearts. And so we renounce the world so that we can love the world. Okay? I'll say one more thing about fasting, actually, because a lot of people, are kind of shocked when I say this. Did anybody ever think that when they fast, they're actually performing a miracle? No? Why not? Is fasting a miracle? Sometimes. Sometimes it is, yeah. What is a miracle? How do we define a miracle? Anyone?
Something unusual happening.
Something unusual. Okay, yeah. Sometimes that's not a miracle. Sometimes it's just something we don't know. But yes, it can be unusual. Fasting is usually unusual. At least for me it is. So it's, it's something out of the ordinary. Many people would define a miracle as something that goes against the laws of nature. Yeah, something we can't understand. Something that usually happens. We can't understand how that happened. It goes against the laws of physics. It goes against everything that we know should happen. Okay? Well, what is fasting? No other human being, no other creation of God can fast. Think about this. Animals can't. They don't have the ability to do it. Animals act on instinct, correct? If they're hungry, they will eat, right? But we, although we are a type of animal, a mammal, we are created in the image of God, though. And so we have free will. So we are the only creation in the universe that can fast even unto death for a higher purpose. So we are going against our own physical nature. Are we not performing a miracle? Did you ever think about that? You guys are performing miracles every day now in Lent. There you go. Every day. Every day you fast. You go against your fallen nature. You go against what your body is telling you to do. And you're not going against it because of nature, because of the way the world works, but you're going against it because of a divine calling to do so, to become like God. And that is a miracle. That is something beyond anything that anybody can ever describe or explain. So at least that's the way I see it. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to close up a bit so we have some time for Q&A. Some pitfalls, because I know in the title we said, some dangers and pitfalls and difficulties in fasting and in the Lenten journey. We established that, obviously, in order to become truly spiritual people, we need to learn how to use the material world. We can only use the material world in the right way if we are not addicted and controlled by it. This is where fasting comes in. This is where Lent comes in. Okay, that's where we are right now. Today, we celebrate, a few days ago, but today, we had the parade. We're celebrating Independence Day. Very interesting that we're talking about freedom again and slavery. And today we're also celebrating the ethnic, Greek Independence Day, the idea of throwing off the tyranny of the Ottoman Empire from the Greek state. And again, we have this kind of theme of rebellion, of breaking free. However, the theme of today, at least from a cultural point of view, again, is a worldly theme, right? It's talking about freedom, the idea of freedom in this world. It's not a bad thing to celebrate the Greek Independence Day. It's a good thing, of course, from a national point of view. It's a wonderful thing. We remember our ancestors, we remember our culture. However, it is not necessarily the same thing as what we're talking about, because interior freedom and spiritual freedom can never be taken away. It doesn't matter how many people oppress you. And we see this throughout history, right? And this is why the Orthodox Church was able to survive for 400 years under the Ottoman Empire and not be extinguished. It's proof of that. Because the church had interior freedom and continues to have interior freedom. It continues to have that idea of emancipating people, of freeing people from this world, regardless of what's happening on the outside. And so sometimes it's important not to confuse the two. Because sometimes what happens is the worldliness seeps into the church, right? So what happens is every time we have problems in the church, we talked about the church being separate from the world, ecclesia being called out, being something different. But what happens is that when we see conflict within the church, we see conflict in our church boards, in the Philoptochos, in the Goya, in different organizations. We see people fighting. We see power struggles. We see the priest acting inappropriately. We see a bunch of stuff happening. Okay, that is when we forget what the church is, and we try to take the world into the church. We forget about leaving it at the door. We forget about what we're there to do, right? If you guys are paying attention to the liturgy, right after we read the gospel and we get into the cherubic hymn, what does the priest say? Let us set aside all cares of this life that we may receive the King of all. That's what he says. Let go of everything. Right? And so we are supposed to be leaving everything behind and entering into a new reality. And so this is what Lent is all about. And this is really what the church is all about all the time. It's about training ourselves to see a new reality, perspective. And this is where I come back again to my experience of Mount Sinai. Because as a young man at 15 years old, I didn't know the things that I know now as a priest. And so, of course, my experience now would be different than my experience then. However, looking back now on my experience, I can truly say that I can understand it better, even though I'm not there, even though I'm not walking those steps right now. It's in my memory. And so I look at that experience of climbing in the darkness, struggling to get to the top, seeing my fellow pilgrims following me in the darkness, which means that I'm not alone, which is exactly what Lent is all about. We go to church because we're not alone. We're all one big family. And so when we get scared and we get weak, we have each other to lean on. That's a very beautiful and heartwarming thing. But when you get to the top, that is where the experience changes. And this is where I want to end, at the resurrection. The resurrection is coming in 2 weeks. Okay? It's coming. You can't stop it. It's going to be there. And the thing is this, is that Everyone's going to experience the resurrection. Everyone. Doesn't matter who you are. Well, all Orthodox Christians. Everybody else doesn't care. Okay? All of us. And we know this because on Holy Saturday night, it's going to be thousands of people in all the churches. Everybody comes out of the woodwork, people you haven't seen in years. Okay? We're going to see. And they're all there for the light. Right? If you're lucky like me, you'll see the drive-by light. I've actually seen people drive the car up, roll the window down, and get the... I've seen it everywhere. I've seen it at St. Nick's. I've seen it everywhere, right? So, trying to get it and then keep going, right? So it happens. But seeing that, you see different types of people that come to the resurrection. You see people who are there and who stay until the very, very end so that they can receive Holy Communion, which is the most important part. You see people who come, they'll stay a little bit, but then they'll get tired and leave. You see people who just come for those 5 minutes for the light. They'll say Christos Anesti, maybe they'll light a firecracker, and they leave. Okay? Different people come to the resurrection. But we all come to the resurrection. Why? Because Christ reveals himself to all people. The resurrection is for everyone. Okay? The difference is not the resurrection. The light is the same. The difference is us, our perception, how we come to it. So, I get back to climbing the mountain. The person who climbs that mountain, which is the Lenten journey, who goes through the difficulties, who goes through the ups and downs, who does the fasting, who goes to the services, who falls and gets back up again, but they get there. Their experience of that resurrection, their experience of that light coming over the Sinai mountains is very, very different than the person who takes the helicopter to the top. The person who takes the helicopter to the top, okay, they get there, they get off, they look around, they see the sunrise, it's beautiful, very nice. Then they go back down again, right? That will be a different understanding than the person who clawed their way up the mountain. And this is the difference in the Lenten journey for us, is that we have the choice how we prepare. We have the choice how we participate. Everybody comes. St. John Chrysostom in his catechetical homily, which we read on that night, unfortunately most people have left by the time we read it, where he says that the table is set and all are welcome, those who have fasted, those who have not fasted, those who came at the first hour, those who came at the third hour, those who came at the 8th hour, those who came at the 9th hour. Everybody is welcome, right? Everybody. Yes, that's true. But their perception, their experience of the light of Christ will be different. And this is why, for those people who actually try to take the journey, who try to struggle spiritually, their experience is much more profound than those people who go to church every year at Pascha, get the light, and then go home for the Magiritza. Okay? It's two different realities, but it's the same event. It's the same event. It's the difference between those who have climbed outside of the cave and have seen the truth and have been changed forever and are now coming back to tell everybody else, and those who are saying, whatever, it's okay. I'm happy just looking at the shadows. I'm happy with my life the way it is. I'm happy with eating the burger every day of the week, obviously. Okay? This is the big difference. And so the Lenten journey is really a shift in perception. It's a change in reality. It's a change in the way we view ourselves, the way we view our fellow human beings, the way we view God, and the way we view the light of the resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Ted, for your wonderful presentation. Informative, deep in thought. Very good. We'd like to open up the floor to anyone who has any questions, comments on Father's presentation. So now the floor is open. There's a microphone set up there for you to speak from. Thank you.
Anybody? No? Oh, yeah. Just project.
I can do that. Good afternoon. Father Ted, thank you. You talked about, and I took notes, being selfless is not always happy, but it's holy.
Yes.
So Philippians, somewhere kind of in the middle, it says, do things without complaint.
Yes.
Now, sometimes that's hard as you use yourself. So what can we do as human beings to overcome that, to be maybe we're supposed to just, I don't know, embrace that feeling.
Wayne?
Oh, I have to do this, but I'm going to do it controlling. Joy who with the Antiparistia, like a joy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, any tips, any thoughts on that? Any?
Okay. I'll speak from personal experience.
Okay.
So you mentioned joy, which is a very interesting word. It's very important because there's a difference between happiness and joy. I talk about this a lot in my church. Happiness, as I said, is a feeling. So it's very shallow. Lots of things can make us happy. A little piece of chocolate can make me happy. But joy is something, at least from a spiritual point of view, that is much more profound, and it usually stems from the feeling. It's not even a feeling. It's more of an understanding within yourself that you're doing what is right. And I think all of us have had that feeling at some point in our lives where sometimes, it's really hard to do what's right, but you do it, and then afterwards, it was tough, but you did the right thing, and there's a satisfaction that comes from it. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. And there's a deep joy in, knowing that what you did was correct. Maybe you helped somebody by taking a hit, by giving something away that you really needed, right? And so, the joy and the happiness is always a difficult balance to strike. I would say that number one is to understand, first of all, to remind ourselves what the goal is. And the goal is to be joyous in Christ and not to be necessarily happy all the time. Or as I like to say always, our goal is to be holy, not happy. And usually most holy people, if we look at the lives of the saints, had horrible lives, a lot of tragedy, a lot of suffering. And yet most of them, when you read their lives, we'll take St. John Chrysostom again, just because we mentioned him before. He was exiled 3 times in his life. He died in exile the 3rd time in anguish, and the last things on his lips were glory to God for all things. So, that's a person who had joy, but was not necessarily happy. Okay. Myself as a priest, being in my lifestyle, I won't say line of work, but in the life that I lead, for us, it's usually go all the time, right? You're on call 24 hours a day. We don't just work on Sundays, like most people think, but we are on call all the time. And so there are those days where you're just exhausted. You're just, you're spiritually drained, you're mentally drained, and you really have nothing left. And, sometimes you're coming home like at 2 a.m. in the morning because you were at a hospital and you had a 16-hour day already and you haven't seen your kids like in 3 days. And you're kind of, getting out of the car and you're really tired. But sometimes at those moments you feel that joy because that even though you're exhausted, even though, you're behind on your bills, you haven't seen your kids, this and that, whatever, that though you made a difference, you were there for people that needed you. You were there, you were doing the right thing, and it was a selfless thing. And so that makes you feel good, but not on a shallow level. Like that's the joy that I'm talking about. And that's really what keeps me going personally, that sometimes at your lowest point, that's when you're the strongest, right? When I'm weak, I'm strong, as the Apostle Paul says. So, does that answer your question? I hope so. Yeah. Lucy?
Well, you were 15 when you had the experience of climbing the mountain, right?
Yes.
And you could not only walk, you could run. But to your experience, is this a climb that can be achieved by any age? Or what age would it be?
Are you talking about Mount Sinai or the Lenten journey? Oh, the actual Mount Sinai. Okay, well, you're going to get me in trouble, Lucy. I think all things are possible at all ages. There's some 20-year-olds who can't climb it, and there's some 90-year-olds who climb Mount Everest. So, the physical side of it, if we have the great blessing to be able to go on a pilgrimage in our lives, I think we should do it. But it's not the be-all and end-all of religious experience. What does Christ say to Saint Fotini at the Samaritan at the well? He says that God is, he goes, the time is coming and now is when people will not worship neither in Jerusalem nor on this mountain, which is where the Samaritans would worship, but they will worship God in spirit, right?
But there is help on the walk?
Well, there are camels. There are camels. There's camels. There's Bedouins. They'll help you up. Yeah, you can get up there personally. So if you can do it, you try. Thank you. If you can do it, you try. But if you can't, what I'm trying to say is if you can't, don't be disheartened. You know, it's always wonderful to be able to go to these things. I've had the great blessing to go twice in my life now. I'm 34 now in half a month, and in a month. And, you know, I was able to go to Jerusalem twice in my life. But even if you can't go ever in your life, doesn't mean you can't be, you know, you cannot achieve theosis, right? Because everything we need is in the church, right? And thank God that every single local church is the fullness of the church. It is the body of Christ. So it doesn't matter whether you're in a little village somewhere or whether you're in Jerusalem. It's the same Eucharist. It's the same light of the resurrection on that Pascha night. So that's important to remember. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just picking up on the other point you made there about somebody who may not be able to fulfill that journey, that Lenten journey, because of a condition they have or a situation they're in. Whether it's a physical situation, a medical, physiological, or mental health situation, they can't follow through with that Lenten journey. Can you talk about God's grace and mercy to give them a perception that's needed for their life in a merciful way?
Sure. Very good question. So I guess I should clarify first. When I say taking the Lenten journey, it does not necessarily mean I followed all the rules and therefore I'm a good person, right? Yes, the church has certain prescribed fasting. However, every person undertakes that journey, first of all, with the advice of their spiritual father, the person that they're confessing to, which of course we're all supposed to be confessing, right, everyone? And also according to their ability, right? So the journey is different for everybody, right? The fact that somebody might be climbing the equivalent of Mount Sinai and somebody else might be climbing the equivalent of Mount Everest is irrelevant, right? You may be stronger. You can climb a Mount Everest style of journey, right? I may not be able to climb the hill at the park down the street. The point is that we both are making the effort. And so I think that God, he really looks at the effort, not necessarily the outcome. And so the grace of God is much greater than anything that we can ever imagine. And we can't really measure spirituality. You know, we like to because it makes us feel better about ourselves, but we shouldn't be measuring anything like that. Rather, the Lenten journey is both social, but also very personal. So social in what way? Of course, we're supposed to be helping each other along the way. And that's something that's neglected, unfortunately. I think a lot of times we make it an esoteric kind of esoterico, thing, and we forget about everybody else. And we actually become more judgmental during Lent because we feel that we're moving forward and everybody else doesn't care. When we should be stopping and waiting for somebody to climb up the mountain and grab their hand and bring them up with us. But also, it's also a very internal journey in the sense that we should not be caring what the other person is doing, in the sense like that maybe they can't fast in the same way that we can. Well, that doesn't make a difference. The point is, are they trying? I think the only time that we get into spiritual danger is when we don't care at all, when we basically just don't even bother climbing the mountain or anything. Like, we lose sight of the summit. We don't care. I don't need it. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people, even within our church, who are at that point where they just say, it's the idea of that I've become so accustomed to the worldliness, to the secular life, that I see this as slavery. And so why would I ever want to do it? And I think that is extremely dangerous, right? Because then there's no spiritual progress there at all. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
In your opinion, Father Ted, I want to ask you, what is hell, in your opinion?
That's a big one. What is hell? Well, that's an interesting one. All right. Well, I'll give you. Although there are a lot of metaphors about what hell is in the Fathers of the Church, right? And I use the term metaphor because anytime you hear about hell, right, it's always a metaphor because we are trying to explain something that is unexplainable, like any spiritual reality, right? What is heaven like? It's a big nightclub in the sky, like you see in a lot of movies, right? With clouds and cherubs and things like that. I think that none of those things even go close to what it actually will be. But there are a few examples that the Fathers give us that are very interesting. And of course, when we listen to the hymnography of the Church, especially during Holy Week, we do hear a lot of really scary imagery, fire and things like that, because it's there to make us understand the severity. But it's poetry. I don't want you to think of hell as a place where there's actual little pitchforks, One of the most profound kind of visions of what eternal torment, I guess you could say, would be, is actually given to us by St. Gregory Palamas. And what does he say? He says that hell is the love of God to those who don't want it. Think about that. So it comes back to the idea, yeah, it's profound. It's, is because when the second coming happens, right, God will be all things in all places, right? He's everywhere. You can't escape him. You can't escape the light of God. And so everyone will be brought forth in front of him, right? Now, there are two types of people, like the goats and the sheep, right? But what are the two types of people? Well, they're the people who are people of the light. We hear this in the Gospel of John. Jesus uses this analogy. When he talks about judgment, he says, they're the people, the light has come into the world, he says. St. John the Evangelist says, right? And but the people do not love the light because their deeds are evil. And so they hide in the darkness, right? So he says those people who are of the light will come to the light because they want their deeds to be shown, because they're proud of them. But those people who do evil will hide in the darkness because they're ashamed and they don't want anybody to see their deeds. So the more you live your life in the light, you become accustomed to that light. And so when the true light comes, you will embrace it. It will not hurt. But when you live your life in darkness, right, when that light comes, it will burn. It will burn. It's still the love of God. It's not God punishing you, but rather it's us. Again, it comes back to what I actually said in my speech. The light of the resurrection is going to come for everybody. The just and the unjust, the good and the evil. The question is, how are we going to experience it, right? Is it going to sting? Is it going to burn our eyes? Or are we going to embrace it? And so I like that analogy. There are many other ones, but that's a very beautiful way of seeing it, that, it's not God who punishes, because God is love. We have those terms in our poetry, obviously. Yes, it's there. But we have to be careful about taking them literally. But rather, it is us who change. We who punish ourselves, rather than God. God is just basically saying, this is the truth. Can you handle it? Anything else? Yes?
So what would you say when some people, from the day one that they're born, they struggle all their life till they die?
Mm-hmm.
Some people from day one, they can hold their life smooth and easy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say thank God for the people who struggle, number one, because struggle produces endurance, and endurance produces faith, as the Apostle Paul says. So I'd rather be one of the people who has difficulties, because difficulties produce strong character, strong will, and a strong soul, strong spirituality. People who have it easy usually also are lazy, right? Not all, but struggle is a good thing. It's a good thing. It's the way we learn. Why certain people have easier lives, quote unquote, than others, I can't answer that question. Number two is that I'm not so sure that our perception of an easy life is necessarily accurate, because we may see some people who are affluent, who maybe are born into rich families, maybe never had any type of disease, seem to be enjoying themselves. Maybe they're really happy, but do they have joy? Perception. Right? So they may be living what the world says is a good life, but spiritually they could be dead. Right? And so spiritually they could be suffering because they're addicted to all those things, right? They can't love. Meanwhile, the person who is struggling, it seems to our perception, at least to the world's perception, that they are struggling, they're having a horrible life, maybe they have some diseases, maybe they have serious loss, nothing goes right for them, but deep down, they are stronger and they're more alive than anybody else, right? So our perception is what needs to change, right? So to answer the question, I don't know if I can answer the question, because I would have to meet those people. I would have to speak to them and form a relationship with them. I can't just say, oh, you have an easy life and you have a hard life. Well, who's to say? Their hard life could be in here, right? Yeah. You don't know. Yes?
Thank you very much for your speech today, and also for YouTube. I thought you were really cool. You
Thank you.
look like, I don't know, movie star.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, during Lent, what is our responsibility to those who don't know Christ? That's it.
Okay, that's a good question. Well, since you mentioned YouTube, were you referring to the Hungry for God thing?
Yeah, that was so cool.
Okay, so please explain to everybody. Does anyone know what the Hungry for God challenge was? Anyone? No? Explain to them what it is.
I can't.
No?
I can't suggest it,
Okay.
Even like camera angles are really cool. I have a better visual memory than actual auditory memory.
Okay, so
But very cool.
thank you. It was supposed to be cool. Thank you. We're supposed to like reach out, right? So get people to pay attention. So I did this little Lenten challenge for myself and for my friends on the internet because I kind of got tired of, and myself included, of focusing on the self, which Lent can become a very selfish endeavor. Trying my fasting and what I'm doing and how many services am I going and how many medallions I'm doing and all these kind of things, right? And meanwhile, I haven't helped one poor person. And of course, St. John Chrysostom, always talks about the poor people. And he always tells us, and all the fathers say, that the second half of this Lenten journey is helping the poor, right? The money that you don't spend on meat and cheese and milk and all those wonderful things, you're not supposed to keep it in your bank account. You're supposed to give it away, right? So if that was the case, then all the Christians, the millions who are at least follow Lent, which would be, let's say, Orthodox and Catholics and maybe some Anglicans who actually do Lent, if all those people were giving all that money away, we wouldn't have any poverty, right? But obviously we don't do that. So it is one of those, the social aspect is always neglected during Lent. It's a big problem in the church. And so basically I said, okay, well, I'm going to challenge myself and I'll challenge everybody else who at least I know on the internet. So I made this little video called Hungry for God, kind of a double meaning, I'm going to be hungry. And also I will be hungry I have hunger for God. And so basically I said, for every day of Lent, for the 47 days, 40 days plus Holy Week, I will skip a meal, whether it be breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And for every meal that I skip every single day, I will either buy a meal for somebody who is homeless or somebody who's on the street. And if I can't do that, because maybe I'm physically not there at that time, depending on what I'm doing that day, I will set aside $3 to $5 a day and donate at the end to a local mission. It can be anybody. I chose obviously St. John the Compassionate because it is our Orthodox mission. They do phenomenal work. But if somebody is in another country or another city, because I have friends all over the place who are kind of doing it, as long as they're donating to a place that feeds people, that gives them food, right, which is the most basic thing. So really, I'm choosing to be hungry so that one other human being can eat. And so we kind of try to make that go viral and try to get a lot of people and to challenge people to kind of do that during this Lenten season. I don't know how many people are doing it because we didn't ask to people sign up or anything. We just wanted people to go do it, but we did ask people to share some of their experiences, not to gloat or to show off what they're doing, but rather maybe post a few things we made a Facebook group. We have like over 1,000 people on it. Maybe some people put up like some really nice pictures. Some kids, Agoya in Vancouver was making sandwiches for the homeless for Hungry for God. Another person actually met somebody on the street and they videotaped it. It's about raising awareness so that people can know that this is what we're supposed to be doing. Now, of course, there is the balance because we get the criticism too, right? So the criticism is, Father, we shouldn't be doing this because we're not supposed to, show our fasting. We're not supposed to show what we're doing. The right hand should not know what the left hand is doing, right? As the scripture says. Of course, the scripture also says that let your light so shine in front of men so that they can see your good works and glorify God. And so I think that as long as we're doing it in the spirit of humility and actually trying to help people, we have to show an example. And if the priests don't do it first, who's going to do it, right? And so, we'll see what happens at the end and if it had any kind of effect on people or not. I always say that if you have 1,000 people doing it and they're all feeding one person every day for 47 days, that's 47,000 mouths that are fed just from a little challenge. That's wishful thinking that all 1,000 people in the group are actually doing it. But even if it's 100 people, even if it's 200 people, who cares? That's right. It's more people than got fed before, right? So that's what we were talking about, and that's just going to your question, the idea of our obligation during Lent. You asked the question, how do we help? You didn't ask the question, how do we help the poor? You said, what is our obligation to spread the gospel? Well, spreading the gospel is feeding the poor, because we're not supposed to proselytize as Orthodox Christians. We're not supposed to sit there and go, hey, I'll give you food, but you got to become an Orthodox Christian. No. We're supposed to love everybody equally. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they be atheist, Jew, Muslim, Christian, whatever. We're supposed to be selfless, right? And so I don't even think that we need to talk about the gospel necessarily. We just need to live it. We just need to show love. And if people want to ask questions after, they can. But if they don't, it's okay. That's okay. Anyone else? I don't know if we have another time limit, Father, but it's up to you. It's almost 5.
Any other questions?
So, Father, just a quick question.
Yes.
I'm not sure if it's relevant for Lent, but in the last couple of years, I've noticed, particularly around Christmas, I guess an increased awareness, or maybe it's a militant atheism.
Yes.
Which I hadn't seen years ago.
Mhm.
I know there are lots of people that maybe not believe in God at all, but I've never seen until the last couple of years a more aggressive militantism. People putting banners on buses at Christmas time and being very, disrespectful, but in their own way, they believe that there's nothing to believe in, and so should you. It's not enough just that person doesn't believe, but they want you to not believe. How has that come up a lot amongst in your parish, or have you had much experience with that? I particularly mean some scientific people have come forward, and Stephen Hawking recently in that movie, and a couple of other more sort of quasi-scientific people have come forward, and they're not just saying, this is what I believe, you should believe it too.
Yes.
Or you should disbelieve what you believe. How did you confront that?
I agree with you that the trend is there. I think most of it is probably because of the horrible way Christians treated those people in the past. The truth. That I think that Christians, generally speaking, I'm not just saying Orthodox Christians, but Christianity as a whole, especially in the Western world, got comfortable for a long period of time with being kind of like the predominant religion, right? It was just an institution, right? It was everywhere. And so it was very, very easy to forget that you had to be a Christian. You have to show love, not just say you are. And so all those years of oppressing the marginalized, it doesn't matter what group you want to pick right now, right? Does it make a difference? The sex ed thing that we have in the school problem, homosexuality, gay pride parade, you name it. Anything that's going on right now that is militant atheism, right? With not just Neil deGrasse Tyson and all them and Richard Dawkins, all those people were marginalized by the Christian West, right, for many, many, many years, right, because the Christians were not actually showing the love of Christ; they were just showing judgment. So now it's their turn. It's the pendulum is just swinging the other way, right? So now, because they have the upper hand, there's more of them, and they have a louder voice. It's more popular. Now they're gonna basically punish the other side, right? Both sides are wrong because the approach is not loving, and the approach is not respectful. I think from both sides, the Orthodox Church is absent because unfortunately the Orthodox Church doesn't have a strong stand because it's not so visible. It's getting there, but it's not so visible because the Orthodox Church would say, well, hey, we don't agree with either side necessarily, right? We would say that we don't have a problem with science, right? But nobody's listening to us because we're a minority, right? So that's where I think the Orthodox Church has a voice, right? To say, well, we're not necessarily on the far right, with, for example, Catholics and evangelical Protestants, whatever, saying, we're not saying what they're saying, and we're not saying what the far left is saying. We're saying something in the middle that is much more balanced, right? Which is what Holy Tradition reveals to us. And I think that's where it's a very important time for us now to witness, but we can't witness by yelling at people and joining picketing and things like that. We have to witness by love, I think, and that's much harder to do. But again, that comes back down to the not just the Lenten journey, but our own personal spirituality. You can't give what you don't have. So if we're not spiritual people first, if we're not truly Christians, then how are we going to expect other people to respect us? Right. Yes?
Look, I was thinking through a question around, how do you remain humble when you're in a position of leadership? I think you sort of answered that actually with your comments around even the act that you're doing to the YouTube video with mindfulness and humility. And I guess my question is, you sort of struck a chord with me when you said that you prowl around the cities of Toronto and hospitals at 2 in the morning, because I do that too, and
sure.
the work that I do, which is on a religious capacity. But does the church provide for you? I worry about you for Father Rudimos. I know that you're good friends. Does the church provide a framework and a structure of support for you as priests that allows for privacy and humility and support within each other as a group is tremendous strain on your families, on you as individuals. I know what it's like to be on call 24 hours a day. It's physically and emotionally exhausting, as you already alluded to. But I'm relatively new to Orthodoxy. I'm married into it 11 years ago. But I'm just curious to know if there is formal structure and infrastructure and support in place for you.
In Canada, no, unfortunately. Yeah, there's not a lot of support for the priests, unfortunately. So that's not the sob story, but it's just the reality, right? So so people can understand that there's not much of by way of programming or counseling or anything like that for priests, and because the perception is that they don't really work that much, or there is a very common perception of that, unfortunately, in the Orthodox, especially amongst Greeks, and so it is, and then sometimes it's also. We have to understand, we did a seminar actually when I was president of the Clergy Association a couple of years ago. We did a clergy retreat focused on clergy burnout and stress. And we spoke about things that were never even brought up before in a clergy retreat in Canada. They were unheard of, about clergy fatigue, burnout, depression, things like that. And also the idea of what is called, at least in ministry, compassion fatigue, which manifests itself like post-traumatic stress disorder. And so a lot of priests are not trained to be able to like separate the problems of their parishioners from their personal lives. And so they have those stresses, they bring them home. And so there's a lot of problems that are happening there. But again, that comes back down to spirituality, because although you can be exhausted and you can be very stressed, but if you have a balanced spirituality, then you can learn how to say no, right? And not have guilt for it. So, for example, I have twins, I have a third on the way, I am tired, I have a lot of things on my plate, but at the same time, I have to take time for my family, and that has to be okay, because sometimes what happens is the spiritual sickness, which is like, for example, ego, which we're the worst, the priests, because of the position that we're in, your ego says, I have a God complex, I need to save everybody. Well, you can't save everybody because you can't even save yourself. So what good will you be to anybody if you're sick, if you're tired, if you're mentally you're not strong? So you have to be able to say no, and also to know your limitations. If you know that you can't do this, then there's no shame in saying I can't do this, or help me, or call up Father Haridim and say, hey, I can't do this. Can you please, if you have some time, can you help me here? Or call up another priest and say, can we have a support system, right? So that comes back down to spiritual problems, because again, if it has to do with humility, it has to do with the idea that we don't save anybody, Christ saves us, and then we just simply basically do the best we can to lead people to Him, not to ourselves. And I think that's where it starts, and then everything else, support systems, things like that, need to be built in with that thing in mind, that we don't save people. So, yeah. Yes.
Well, the youth ever come back into the school. The Jews have their holidays, the Muslims have their rules, but the Christians don't seem to have anything.
Well, prayer coming back, the question is, will prayer ever come back to the schools? And, we see Muslims have a room to do their prayers, and Jews, whatever, and we don't. Well, officially as like the whole school system, I don't think so, because we live in a multicultural society, and from the moment that we accept that, I don't think that necessarily, and I know this is radical for a priest to say, we don't live in a Christian society anymore. We just don't. And it's a lie to say that we do. There are more non-Christians living in Canada right now than there are Christians, even though right? So, but even if we weren't the minority, if you're going to have a truly multicultural society, you can't impose the Lord's Prayer in schools where more than half your kids are not Christians. You just can't. That's not loving. That's not loving. That's imposing, right? And as far as rooms, we could do that. We just don't, because we're lazy. Where are the Orthodox parents calling up the schools and saying, I want to make sure my kid has a prayer corner to be able to do their prayer with the other Orthodox students? The Orthodox students don't care. That's the reality. I'm not trying to be blunt about it, but that's the reality. I've seen maybe one or two, but I've never seen any parents or students that passionate about their spiritual life that they actually want to do it at school. The Muslims are, and so are the Jews, and so are a lot of other religions. But it's our fault. It's not, I want to blame everything on society. The society will only do as much as we allow them, right? It's just, it's us that we need to voice our opinions, right? So again, it comes back down to our own spirituality again. Take the journey. Yeah. Is that okay? Thank you again. Hello, Pastor.